Does real estate determine everything? Simon Winchester will join us to talk about his latest book, Land: How the Hunger for Ownership Shaped the Modern World. What should we know about the things we buy that are made in China? Amelia Pang will be here to discuss her book, Made in China: A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. Alexandra Alter will have an update from the publishing world. Plus, our critics will join us for the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast for the New York Times. It's February 12th. I'm Pamela Paul. Simon Winchester joins us now from the Berkshires. His latest book is called Land: How the Hunger for Ownership Shaped the Modern World. Simon, so good to have you here.
Well, lovely to be here. Thank you.
By here, we mean, of course, a little bit afar. The last time I think you were on this podcast, it was in person. But perhaps it is fitting that you are on your own piece of land for this conversation. How did you come to want to write a book about land and land ownership?
I used to live in Hong Kong and came back in 1997 when Hong Kong passed back into the hands of the Chinese, as of course it should have done. Then decided, largely on the advice of, oddly enough, the then New York Times correspondent in Hong Kong, that I should perhaps move to New England. And so rather than go to London, I came to the New World. I'd been a correspondent here in the 70s and the 80s for The Guardian, and bought a little cottage in a town called Wassaic, about 110 miles north of New York in Dutchess County. The house had a few acres of garden and stuff around it, but there was a plumber from the Bronx called Caesar Luria who owned a fairly large tract surrounding the house, and he used to come up there and hunt. And he was a very nice man, and he would, after hunting each season, he would leave me a cooler with venison and always a bottle of cognac, which was particularly nice. Then after 3 or 4 years, he said to me that he was tired of paying the taxes on this land. Would I like to buy it? And he named a price, and I said, well, yes, why not? Okay. So I bought the land, and it was pretty useless, I have to say. It was mostly on the north face of a mountainside, so it wasn't good for raising animals, and I had this vague fantasy that one day I might. But it was sort of beautiful, and there were a couple of little streams and lots of trees, some of them quite magnificent, and there were oaks and hickory and, of course, an awful lot of pine and cherry and ash, and a lot of animals. There we saw a bobcat once, and there were deer, of course, aplenty, and rabbits and so forth. And I liked it, but it was not particularly useful. And eventually, with this sort of fantasy I had of maybe one day having animals, I came up here to the Berkshires. I sold that the house down there, but kept the land. And then there was this sort of major shift in my attitude towards it when, in 2011, I became a citizen of this country. And suddenly I realized that by owning these 130-odd acres down in Dutchess County, I was actually invested in the country to which I'd now become a citizen. So I then became rather more interested in the land itself and in its history. So I started digging around and realized, obviously, that I had bought it from this Mr. Luria, and he had indeed, prior to that, bought it from someone else. And so the chain went back until it stopped in about the late 17th century. There was paperwork all the way back to then.
Wow.
And then, I know, extraordinary, Dutchess County and Poughkeepsie, they've got all the papers. But then it came to a shuddering halt because it was at that time that the documents were mainly written in Dutch, where Henry Hudson's explorers, who had come up the river, that now has his name, but he was working, although being British, he was working as an agent for the Dutch. And he had first acquired land from the original settlers of my land, who were the Mohican Indians. But they didn't have the concept of ownership. They hunted and they gathered and they settled and all the rest of it, superintended, but didn't own. And then I began to think, well, the difference between their attitude to the land, and their feeling was that you could no more own land than you could own the breeze or the ocean, to my attitude, which is that this is mine and shoo everybody away, at least I had the right to do so. That was an interesting development, and I thought maybe there would be a book. And so I put it to my editor, and she said, yes, that would be an admirable idea, but don't keep the United States only. Have a look at where this originated and how it occurs all around the world. And so there was a lot of travelling and wandering about, all beginning, though, in Dutchess County.
Do you just do that in your life? You just start digging around and doing all that historical research without even knowing that it's a book? Or is that typical of your, I think I might write a book process?
It is really. I mean, sometimes a story falls into my lap and you say, my God, this is an obvious book. But generally, you think, I'd like to write a book about the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. How would you do it? And you start digging around and realize that there is a potential narrative thread that would make this actually work as a story. I mean, there are heaps and heaps of academic and often, sadly, not dreadfully readable books about the concept of land ownership, most of which I now have, and of course have had to use as source material or advice, but actually turning it into a narrative, that's what seems to happen.
You've written many, many books, and if I had to kind of group them in a very basic way into two groups, and I'm sure that this is going to miss a lot of books and nuance, but you have books where you do have that very specific story. Of course, The Professor and the Madman, Krakatoa, there's this obvious beginning and an ending. And then you have these great big sweeping books like The Atlantic and the Pacific that you mentioned, and all of your travel books, whether in Korea or Hong Kong. Do you try to, in that latter category, find some kind of narrative through story?
I do, and that, I think, is very important. If there's very few occasions where I've been asked to sort of teach writing, not that one really can, I say there are three things. The idea, you've got to have a good idea, and it'd be nice if you can write it elegantly and so forth. But the crucial thing is to get the structure of the book right. And that takes a lot of thinking about. And so in The Atlantic, I decided in the end to structure it, the ocean around the 7 Ages of Man speech from As You Like It. And in the Pacific, there was a different structure. And in this, the book about land, to try and give it narrative heft, if you like, I thought to myself, well, what do you first need to know about land before you attempt to acquire it? You need to know where it is. So the first part of the narrative is, where is this land and how do I determine where it is on the face of the planet and where are its edges, where are its boundaries? And once you've started that, at least in my case, once I've started that, then it's a relatively, I won't say simple, but a logical process to go from where it is to, okay, how do you then acquire it? And once you've got it, what do you do with it? And do you fight people who are your neighbors? I mean, does this cause warfare? And is it a good idea, ownership? So there are basically 5 broad aspects that have a sort of narrative flow to them. And then within each of those 5 aspects, you find stories that, as it were, it sounds rather crude to say it like this, but slot into that part of the narrative. So I enjoyed the structure as much as anything. And if it works, then it's a readable book.
Is it difficult to figure out what's going to stay in and what goes out? Because it is such a huge topic. I imagine there's so many good stories that you could include or concepts.
Yes, I mean, and this classic one, I mean, I had a editor, lovely person, but she was, for instance, not terribly keen to include one of the stories relating to the invention of a piece of land in Holland, a place called Flevoland. And she said, no, this is very technical and it could be somewhat boring. And I said, no, it's not boring. I mean, I find it completely fascinating. And so I had to fight about that. On the other hand, so I won that little battle. There was another one relating to, I think, the stewardship of land, relating to a big tract of land in far northern Scotland. And she very successfully said, too much Scotland in the book, take that out. And so I lost that. So, you win some and lose some. But it is part of the process of working with an editor, and as brilliant as an editor as I have, Sarah Nelson, a just terrific person, and it's part of the process.
Well, you start off by dedicating the book to Chief Standing Bear. So for those who are not familiar with Native American history, who is Chief Standing Bear and why did you decide to dedicate the book to him?
Well, Standing Bear was a Ponca. The Ponca people lived in what is generally now Nebraska. And like so many Native Americans, they were forced out of their original homes because white people wanted to settle there and farm it. And so they were either persuaded or ordered or sent at gunpoint into the further west, across the river into, let's say, in this particular case, Oklahoma. The thing about Standing Bear is that he took his case to the courts to have himself declared, as the Supreme Court did in 1879, so declare him to be a human being. Because, bizarre though it may sound up to this point, Native Americans, First Nation people in Canada, Aboriginals in Australia, Maoris in New Zealand, were all legally regarded not as humans initially. They were effectively regarded as wildlife. And going to a new continent, where a white settler turning up in a new continent and seeing it populated by wildlife meant that legally they could declare it terra nullius, empty land, no people there, which gave you the right to own it. So this bizarre construct was challenged in the courts, and Standing Bear finally achieved something monumentally important. He was a human being now, entitled to civil rights. Not enough civil rights to allow him to vote. That didn't occur for the Native Americans until the 1920s, bizarrely. So he achieved something in principle which was very important, but, and this is the irony that why I dedicated it to him and his people, they took his land away anyway. So they gave him civil rights, but stole his land. White people moved into it, and he and his like were pushed out. So it's, to me, symbolically important of what was going on and what was going wrong in the settling of America. But it's not only America, it happened in these other countries as well.
How did Standing Bear view land and ownership of land?
Much as the people in Dutchess County, the Mohicans, regarded theirs, and the Lenape down in New York and the Iroquois further north, that, as I mentioned earlier, they didn't own it. The famous speech by Chief Sealth of Suquamish in northwest United States, when he was persuaded to sell land to the white men to build the city that is now Seattle, made this impassioned speech in which he said, "We've never owned this land. We superintend it, we care for it, but it is like the breeze in the trees. It is like the sea that he could see the sea from where he stood. You don't own it. The earth is our mother." I know this is sounding a bit sort of airy-fairy, but very much in line with also what the Aboriginals in Australia believe. This is our mother. It gives us sustenance. We look after it. We care for it. We tend it, and it'll look after us. And that was Standing Bear's view. It was, I dare say, Geronimo's view. It was all of the view of all Native Americans. And one wonders now whether the appointment of Deb Haaland from the Southwest Pueblo people in Arizona, New Mexico, as new Secretary of the Interior, is going to change the mindset of people in this country. It's already changing crucially and very importantly, in my view, in New Zealand, where at last the Maoris, that were subjected to much the same kind of prejudice as were the Native Americans here, the Maoris are being accorded respect. Land is being slowly given back to them that was taken away by the British in the 1840s. Compensation is being paid. In all sorts of ways, the Maori is getting the respect that I would hope in due course the Mohicans here and the Ponca and the Cherokee and the Choctaw will start getting in this country.
It seems clear that there isn't a universal way of viewing land ownership across all cultures. There is this Maori way and various Native American interpretations of what land ownership is. And then there's this Western European notion. But as you say, you covered the entire world. So what are the other concepts of land ownership? How does it work? For example, you mentioned that you lived in Hong Kong, which, of course, belonged to Britain for a period, but now belongs to China. What is land ownership in China, and how has it evolved differently from the way it has here?
There's an overarching similarity in most cultures in the world that the leader of the country, whether he be a president or an emperor or a king, is regarded as, very, very loosely, God's representative on earth. God owns the land, and the agent of God on earth, let us say an emperor in the case of Japan, the celestial kingdom is presided over by the number one celestial, he owns the land and can then, because he's the agent of God, give it, lend it, lease it, whatever, to the people, the favored people, the mandarinate in China, we're talking specifically about China, who are his agents on the ground, and they can do with it further and further and further down the pyramid. And this goes to the concept of owning land in fee simple. It's such a weird word, but taking it back to England, if I may, but it's much the same in China. The Queen is God's representative on earth. God owns the land, owns England. The Queen owns on his behalf and can give lifetime tenure to anyone that she chooses down the pyramid. So in England, if I were to own 20 acres, yes, I'd own it. I'd think I'd own it. I can sell it to other people. I can do with it on whatever I like. But ultimately, it belongs to the Queen, who is the biggest landowner on the planet. Although I dare say, were there today an emperor in China, there isn't, of course, anymore, he, it's always a he, would be the biggest landowner on the planet. But at the moment, the royalty, they, around the world, whether it's Tonga or whether it's New Guinea, they are the owners of the land ultimately, in law, which is why the land can be taken away from you. Various legal permissions are given that you think you own the land, but if I don't pay the taxes on my land here or in Dutchess County, ultimately I'll lose it. So we're all actually tenants.
There's a lot of talk about the increase in income inequality, but maybe less talk about property inequality. And one of the things you point out in your book is just how much land is owned by a small number of landowners. You obviously mentioned the Queen. Is that a trend that continues, or has that been that way for a long period of time?
It's continuing and expanding. If you get this extraordinary publication called the Land Report, which is published every quarter in Texas, which lists the biggest landowners in this country and is absolutely stuffed with advertisements, sort of land porn, as it were, showing these extraordinarily big estates in Wyoming and Colorado and Washington State up for sale for millions upon millions of dollars. The biggest landowners in this country are Ted Turner of CNN, who owns just a little under 2 million acres, and John Malone, also a television mogul, who owns just over. There's sort of bragging rights. Those two are always arguing over who owns the most. The biggest landowner in the world is an Australian woman called Gina Rinehart, who owns 29 million acres, which is about as big as the entirety of England and Wales. There's also this fascinating couple who actually, their activities were revealed in a piece in the New York Times about a year ago, called the Wilkes brothers. They're a pair of people in far west Texas, I think it's Plano, Texas, who made a lot of money in the fracking industry by making the chemicals for fracking. Their company was bought out by the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund, and they suddenly had $2 billion each to play with. So they decided they'd go on a shopping spree for land and bought immense amounts. I think they now own about 750,000 acres in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado. But the crucial thing about them, and this does not apply to either Ted Turner or John Malone, is that they're restricting public access to it. And so forest roads that used to be open, places where in the West it was assumed you could go skiing or walking or snowshoeing or whatever, you can't do. There are now nearly all of their lands. You have security cameras and gates and so forth and security guards.
But why?
But that's a very good question. Why they want the whole notion of trespass, I find absolutely fascinating. And if I can just expand on that a little bit, trespass, and remember, America is the country that invented barbed wire, made by a man called Glidden in the 1890s, I think it was, to keep people off land. There is this pervasive feeling, it's not uniquely American, but it is powerfully American, that once you own it, you put up post-it signs, you put up barbed wire, you put up fences to keep people off. Because one of the 5 bundle of rights, lawyers call it, when you buy land, you get these rights. And one of the rights is that you have an absolute right in law to exclude other people from your land. In Sweden, in Norway, in Denmark, you can't do that. There's this concept of allemansratten, all men's rights to wander over the land of Sweden as you wish. You can't go into people's living rooms and demand a cup of coffee. You can't go into their garden, their private little nook. But if they own, as I do, 130 acres, any person, whether it's in Sweden, would have an absolute right to wander about it. You've got to behave yourself. You can't set fire to it or dig enormous holes in it. But providing you behave in a civilized manner, all Swedish people have a right to be on all Swedish land. And this concept is now spreading, mercifully in my view. It's spread to England and most crucially to Scotland. So this friend of mine, bit that was excluded from the book, he owns 22,000 acres in the very far north of Scotland. He has forest, he has cattle, he has sheep, he has fishing rights on a river, the Helmsdale River. He used to say, this is mine, and theoretically, he didn't care very much, but theoretically, unless invited, no one could come on it. But now, the law says any Scots person can walk about it, can camp on it, can do as they like, providing they behave. This is not true in the United States. If you trespass, and in certain states more vehemently than others, you can be in serious trouble. You can be shot. And that does not occur in Europe.
And is there not a trend towards this notion of open access land in the U.S.?
Not really, not gathering any force. What there is, though, and I find this fascinating, and this is particularly true both here in New England and also in the far northwest, the idea of community land ownership is growing. My own land in Dutchess County, I can give 5 acres a year, it somewhat depends on the IRS's view, to the Dutchess Land Conservancy. That means that they, not me, will own it henceforward, and they pledge that it'll never be improved. There'll never be tract housing on it. It'll be open to all. That's happening. I mean, the village I live in is called Sandersfield, where it isn't happening, but New Marlborough, the next village along, and the next village, Monterey, both of them have got community land trusts, and people who own 200 or 300 acres, and there are quite a lot of people that do, are encouraged to say that when you pass on, or at any time in your life, why not give it to the land trust? We'll look after it for you. People will then have access to it. You'll be seen to have done a good thing. And that notion is gathering force here.
All right, one last question, and it's a kind of future-oriented question, but given global warming, one of the things we talk about is land that will go away, right? It'll be taken by rising seas. And I'm curious if you looked into what the implications are for land ownership and how that might be affecting things now.
I did very much, and indeed wrote a caveat in the book at the very, very beginning to say that we've always thought, have we not, that land is immutable. It's not going anywhere. It's not going to, as Trollope said, it's not going to fly away. Well, that was written long before the idea of global warming was going to happen. And so it is slowly but steadily happening. In the United States, so minimally that nobody notices. In the last 10 years, I think 13,000 acres have been nibbled away, mainly from the East Coast, maybe from the outer islands in the Carolinas. But whole countries are beginning to disappear. Tuvalu, Kiribati Islands in the South Pacific, large tracts of Bangladesh. New Zealand has said we're going to welcome sea level rise refugees whose lands may disappear. So the whole idea of the immutability of land is beginning at long last to change. And as I rather tritely mentioned, we're going to have to look anew at land policy because, to misquote whatever his name was that wrote The Go-Between, the future is a foreign country and they will do things differently there. And that's what's going to happen. Land policy is going to change thanks to sea level rise.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, even though I could ask you 100 more questions. This is such a huge topic, and I really don't know how you do it, Simon. It's so many books on so many enormous topics. What are you going to do next?
Well, I do know, and I'm afraid you're going to be even more dismayed. I'm doing knowledge.
Oh, God. Okay. Well, we'll talk about that when you're done finding out about knowledge in, 2022. Simon, such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much indeed, Pamela.
Simon Winchester's new book is called Land: How the Hunger for Ownership Shaped the Modern World. Tina Jordan joins us now to help us celebrate the 125th anniversary of the book review. Hi, Tina.
Hi, Pamela. How are you?
I am good. I am good. So tell us about something that has happened in the deep past of the book review that we might think about again now.
I'm going to continue the conversation we had last week, which was about the letters page, because the letters page in the early years of the book review functioned as a sort of message board, as a complaint center, as a recommendation engine. And I want to talk about one of my very favorite letters, which isn't actually signed and which was sent in 1899. And I know you'll appreciate this, Pamela. It's called Your Worship of Kipling. And the writer says, "Is there never to be any let up in your worship of Kipling? I can put up with a considerable amount of that sort of thing, but you have brought it close to a state of nausea. And if, as I conjecture, Kipling is not hopelessly conceited, he must be nigh sickening of it himself." So, I love this letter. But the editor replies, and Pamela, I'm sure that you probably wish you could reply to letters in this fashion in this day and age. But anyway, here's what the editor responded. "Times reader will be glad to know that the present number of the Saturday Review has been prepared with a special desire to please him or her. So far as our most eaglish eye has determined, this present number of the Saturday Review does not contain a single article about Kipling, save, of course, the present. But it will be impossible to give the Times reader any future immunity from Kipling. The Saturday Review must give news of books. Its topics must be timely, otherwise it would not long remain alive." Then, that's the end of the letter. There's a little PS clearly added later. It says, "The above had been scheduled for a Kipling-less paper and had been written in perfect good faith when late yesterday afternoon there came to the editor news he had long had an inkling of, but could not print until now. News of Mr. Kipling's new edition of his works. This seemed to us a most important piece of news and could not possibly be held over. Will Times reader please pardon us or at least credit us with good intentions?"
That is really great. Now, readers cannot send in anonymous letters anymore for publication.
Correct.
When did that change?
Even at this point in 1899, they were asking people to sign their names or to sign a name. Most people did, in fact. It's unusual at this point in 1899 to see a truly anonymous letter, although well until, say, 1910 or 1915, I see letters with clearly made-up names. I love the early letters page so much because the letters are so vivid and so opinionated, and people are really, really talking about books and authors.
All right. Well, we will certainly return to the letters page again. Tina, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Amelia Pang joins us now from outside of Washington. Her book is called Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. Amelia, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So there has been a lot of reporting on labor policies in China, labor policies and practices, and, stories about people sleeping in factories and extremely low pay, long hours. But your book is about something completely different. How common is forced labor in China?
Unfortunately, it's extremely common. There are at least 1,000 camps, and there's many different kinds of them. There's the re-education camps for Uyghurs that have gotten a lot of international press in recent years, but there's also facilities called pre-trial detention centers, drug detox centers, legal education centers, and they may not be targeting a specific ethnic group, but everyone detained there is detained arbitrarily. They haven't gone to trial or been sentenced. They often don't have access to a lawyer, and they're held there indefinitely, and they have to do manufacturing work in a lot of the cases. And when I went to China to do reporting and follow the trucks that left these types of facilities, they all had relationships with exporters.
So how do you even find these camps? I mean, are they hidden within China, or is this out in the open?
I know the Uyghur camps are more hidden and the security there is very tight, but everything else is actually out in the open. I was surprised by how easy it was to just walk up to a camp and say you're from an overseas company that wanted to buy products from them, and they would openly admit that the people inside were prisoners and that they do make products and they can work with you.
You mentioned the Uyghur population, and not all our listeners may be familiar with who the Uyghurs are. So tell us a little bit about the Uyghurs and where they live in China.
The Uyghurs are a Turkic minority group who live predominantly in Xinjiang, China. A lot of them prefer to call it their homeland, East Turkestan. They have a long history of oppression under the Chinese government, but it was really in recent years that their lives got a lot worse, and you really saw this mass detainment of Uyghurs for arbitrary reasons. And unfortunately, a lot of these re-education camps are making people do forced labor.
So you mentioned following trucks, right, along these old trade routes. Were you able to also get inside any of these facilities?
I actually did not go to Xinjiang because the security there was too tight. I don't think there was any chance that I could actually get much reporting done. So I mostly spent some time in the bigger cities where you could kind of blend in and as a tourist and not get followed by the police. I didn't want to give myself away by saying something, by obviously that I'm not actually with the manufacturer. So I mostly just hung out the camp outside of the camps, and I talked to the employees on their way to work to try to get more information out of them, and I parked near them and followed the trucks that went in and out.
So when you say employees who worked in these camps, these are the people who are not prisoners but are overseeing the forced labor that takes place there?
Yes, yes. And in one particularly chilling incident, I was at a compulsory isolation drug detox center. And these facilities are essentially reopened, re education through labor camps, which China claimed that all of these camps were closed back when they were getting a lot of media attention and criticism for having them. But these are really very much still labor camps. And the employees who are going there on their way to work will actually refer to this place as a prison. They just kept referring to the place as a prison during our entire conversation. In the end, I asked them, wait, is this a drug detox center or a prison? And then they paused and they said, oh, drug detox center.
What are the living and working conditions like in these forced labor camps?
There's often torture. They often have to work 15 to 20 hours a day. They don't have access to medical care a lot of the times. It's very grueling conditions. Actually, specifically for the drug detox centers, Human Rights Watch did a great investigation just about the drug detox centers and basically proving that these are all essentially labor camps. Nobody is getting any kind of treatment plan for drug addiction. It's just manufacturing work.
How long has this been going on, and is this increasing in prevalence?
Unfortunately, it's been going on for decades. I mean, forced labor has existed in ancient China as well as it did in many parts of the world. But this kind of mass detainment of political dissidents for the express purpose of using them as free labor you really saw that start to happen when the Chinese Communist Party was gaining momentum in the 1930s. And since then, they've only expanded. And these camps the earliest camps were based off of Soviet gulags. So these are pretty horrific places where there's a lot of not just forced labor, but also brainwashing of political dissidents and religious dissidents.
You focus your book, Made in China, around the story of one particular prisoner. And I don't want to go through the entire story because it's totally fascinating, but tell us a little bit about who Sun Yi is and what his story was.
Sun Yi was a Falun Gong follower who was imprisoned many times. And Falun Gong didn't start off political in China, but ever since they organized a very, very large 10,000 person protest in Beijing in the late 1990s, the Chinese government has really made a lot of effort to crush their ability to organize any kind of mass protests like that again. It kind of reminded them of the 1989 Tiananmen Square mass protests. And any kind of mass organizing like that is very dangerous for authoritarian regimes. And so since then, they've kind of taken on like pro-democracy activism in China, and many of them have been imprisoned precisely for their efforts to stand up to an authoritarian regime.
So Sun Yi is imprisoned and he manages to send out an SOS letter. How did he do that and what did it say?
He had to work, 15 to 20 hours a day, but even though he had so little time to sleep, he stayed up to write several of these letters. in hopes that one of them would be found. And only one was actually found by an American consumer named Julie Keith. She was this, pretty average American woman. She's a suburban mom of two. She was shopping at Kmart at the time and got a hold of this very cheap Halloween decoration that was on clearance after Halloween one year. And, she didn't really need it. It actually sat in her storage for about 2 years before she remembered to open it. And so she was very shocked to find this SOS message written by the prisoner who had made this product when she finally opened it. So it just goes to show that the trivialness of a lot of the products that are made in these camps. And in my book, I try to go into, do we as Americans actually need so much of this stuff? And how much is our shopping habits and consumer culture contributing to factors that compel Chinese factories to outsource work to labor camps?
Can you trace the path of one of these manufactured goods from a forced labor camp in China to those trucks that you followed and then to the American market? Because it goes through a lot of steps, right, along the way?
Yes, it's a very complex chain. It goes from the labor camp to the regular factory, and then from the regular factory, it is shipped to ports around the world. And for instance, this one factory that manufactures school supplies, and there would happen to be several shipments that went to the U.S. in recent years. And if you look at the customs records, it does say the specific products and what was the company that served as a middleman that picked up the product in the US. And when I contacted that particular company and asked them, what do you do to ensure that the products you're picking up are not made by forced laborers? And they said, they essentially said nothing, that this is the first time that they're even hearing about this, and they're very concerned and they're going to look into it, but they weren't doing anything to track where these products are actually made. And so then it will pass through their hands and maybe to another middleman before it ends up like at a company like Target or Amazon or any of these big retailers. And so everybody is saying they're doing a lot to prevent forced labor from entering their supply chain, but a lot of these companies don't really have that information.
So essentially, anyone along the supply chain can say, well, they work with a subcontractor and they don't know who the subcontractors are of that contractor and claim deniability in terms of knowing where these goods come from.
Right. Most corporations will say they have a specific list of factories that they have approved for their factories to subcontract work to, and they're not allowed to do any what's called unauthorized subcontracting to any other types of factories that they haven't reviewed. But the truth is, I've talked to many Chinese auditors who say there's a lot of unauthorized subcontracting that happens, and most companies don't actually do enough to figure out if it's happening. For instance, when the Kmart SOS letter made the news and Kmart was getting a lot of bad press, they released a statement saying, in our audits, we found no evidence of forced labor. But I would really push back and ask, what kind of an audit did you do? Because not all audits are made equal. There's a standard audit that might cost a couple $100 that would only check for things like the cleanliness of the factory, the quality of the product and the equipment. That can't detect something as complex as unauthorized subcontracting to a hidden facility like a forced labor camp. And then you have more expensive audits called social compliance audits, and they're more comprehensive. They cost $1,000 or more, and they really look at the wage documents. They might interview some employees and do some more investigating there. But even those, it would be, the auditor said it would be very hard to detect these kind of hidden subcontracting that's happening. And then you have these $5,000 audits that take 5 days to do, where the auditor would cross-analyze wage documents across multiple departments in a factory to make sure that they're not doing any hidden subcontracting that this company doesn't approve of.
And are those effective?
The auditor said those could possibly detect secret subcontracting to labor camps, but how many companies are actually doing those? I think this is where we as consumers can come in and ask, Are you actually doing enough? Can you actually be more transparent about what you look for in your audits? And even just, is your business practice contributing to any of the factors that compel factories to outsource work to forced laborers? For instance, do you give unrealistic production deadlines to factories so that they can actually make the products in that short period of time? Are you offering to pay them such a low price that they can't realistically pay their workers their local minimum wage to make them, that they have to outsource work to labor camps? These are factors that companies can control, and we as consumers can start asking our companies to reveal this type of information.
All right. So realistically, change probably won't happen unless there's a change on the demand side. And you brought up earlier the idea that, this is something that Americans as consumers need to think about and possibly act on. So the question I have is, what do you do as a consumer, right? Most Americans want to get their things cheaply and quickly. How can the average consumer of that product from Kmart or a product from any other low-cost retailer make sure that they're not buying forced labor goods?
I think the first step we can take is, the next time we go shopping online, take a moment to look at that company's sustainability page or their corporate social responsibility page and see exactly what that says, what they say in those pages. Do they reveal the kind of information that you really need to know to ensure this company has done everything they can to make sure there was no forced labor in their supply chain? Do they reveal the kind of audits they do? Do they reveal the prices they actually pay the workers? And my book does go into more details what specific information you should be looking for on those sites. And if they're not revealing them, you can go on Twitter, go on Facebook, and point it out to the company in a really public way and try to gain some momentum in that way.
So you can, as a consumer, go onto any company's website, look for their sustainability policies and go from there, or at least start there.
It's really hard to tell which company isn't using forced labor unless everyone starts revealing more information about their sourcing practices.
This is such an important subject, Amelia. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Pamela.
Amelia's book, again, is Made in China: A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela.
What's new in the publishing world?
This moment in publishing is so fascinating because the publishing industry had one of its best years ever last year, which was totally unexpected. Most people were bracing for a really deep collapse in sales because bookstores were closed. There was a pandemic, an economic crisis, all the things that you would think would cause people to tighten their budgets and maybe not spend on items like books. Instead, publishers had one of their best years in about a decade. So particularly in print, unit sales rose by more than 8%, which is remarkable given that it was a challenge for people to get print books. If you remember early on in the pandemic, Amazon was deprioritizing book shipments, bookstores were closed, but people found other ways. They started shopping for books at Target. Barnes & Noble saw a huge surge in its online sales. And so I think one of the questions that a lot of people in the industry have now is, what is going to carry over post-pandemic? First of all, is there going to be a dip in sales when people decide to go wild and travel and run around and go to concerts and movies and do other things? With part of the spike in sales driven by the fact that everyone was home. Secondly, are we going to see a permanent shift in the retail marketplace where publishers have seen this massive turn to online shopping, not just for ebooks, which are way up and audiobooks are way up, but for print? And obviously Amazon has taken a huge additional share. They already had a massive share of the book market, but so have large retailers like Target and Barnes & Noble, Walmart. Those places are seeing a big growth in their print book sales online. So the question is, going forward, do those behaviors become permanent? The same way you kind of see people buying their groceries online now. I think a lot of people might find that convenient and continue to do that. So on the one hand, it's been good news for publishers. They're seeing book sales rise, but there is a concern about the shift to online, because what that means for them is readers and book buyers aren't exposed to as great a variety of titles as they are when they walk into a store. When you look online, you just kind of see what's there, or you go specifically looking for one book. Maybe you see another one, but it's just not the same experience as browsing in a physical space where your eyes take in all these covers. So that's something that people are quite worried about.
Yeah, I mean, you know how much I enjoy my pessimism, so that's where my mind goes, which is that, how do debut authors break out, especially if they don't get a lot of media coverage? There's no discoverability, there's no browsing, and then also for less well-known backlists that you might come across when you're browsing along shelves, or you see old favorites recommended as staff picks in a local independent store. Just kind of, I don't know, I worry.
I worry too. And I mean, I love seeing those notes that you see in a bookstore and staff picks, and they say why it's their favorite book. And it's so engaging, and you get drawn in by that. Or you go to a certain table maybe it's new nonfiction, and they put some other stuff on there that you might not have considered. And it is, I think, a real concern for the entire industry that if these habits become ingrained in book buyers, it really does shrink the exposure for a lot of authors. And we'll probably see, if that continues, a perpetuation of what has been happening for years, which is that best-selling authors continue to do well. They're the ones whose books are showcased on Amazon and elsewhere, and the algorithm sort of perpetuates that. And everyone else is sort of struggling to get attention and sales.
All right. We should point out, however, that many independent retailers do allow for online sales and phone sales and curbside pickup. So they are all retooling their approach to their customers as well.
Definitely. I think they have adapted in a really remarkably quick and expedient way. And a lot of independent stores say they're going to continue to use those tools. It's a great option for them to tell customers, you know what, if you can't come in, you can order online and we'll get it for you. Also, the distribution system in the publishing world has become so streamlined. So Ingram is the major distributor for both independents and large chains. And so a lot of independents now, where they would have had to wait maybe a week to get a book that was out of stock or longer, can get it pretty quickly in a few days. And so they're able to compete, at least in terms of speed, a lot of times with Amazon, if not on price, because they don't often discount that deeply. But I think people value having those bookstores enough to pay a little more if there is a price difference. So I do think that is a positive sign that independents have adapted. And I don't think they have been hurt as much as they would have been if there was not that opportunity.
Books are worth the full price.
It's true.
All right. Alexandra, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what they are reading and reviewing, our critics, Paul Sagal and Dwight Garner. Hey there.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Dwight, let's start with you. What did you read and review this week?
It was kind of a drag for me. I read the new Chang-Rae Lee novel. And of course, I'm sure a lot of our listeners know who Chang-Rae Lee is, a wonderful novelist who's been around for 3 decades now at least. And his books include Native Speaker and A Gesture Life and A Loft. His books deal with assimilation to some degree, but he's a very elegant writer who often writes from the perspective of older people. In his new novel, which I didn't think worked at all, alas, and I'm a fan of Chang-Rae Lee's, he writes from the perspective of a 20-year-old, and he just doesn't sound like a 20-year-old ever in the book. And it's a serious food novel. It's about this young man. There are many different plot twists, but he ends up meeting this sort of go-go entrepreneur who takes him to China, and they're trying to find the ultimate energy drink, a kind of elixir that would help keep people young. And at the same time, at a slightly different point in time, he's begun living with an older woman and her young son. And both of these tangents are total foodie tangents. In the one, when he goes to China, he eats like mad, which is kind of fun. And back at home, the woman's son becomes a chef who has a pop-up restaurant. And Chang-Rae Lee does have some fun with this book, but the narrator is like one of these Robert Stone characters who has a 1,000-yard stare, even though he's 20. And we learn he's been through some terrible experience. And when we find out what the experience is, the experience itself is so ridiculous that it sort of renders the whole book ridiculous. And I have a hard time taking it seriously, and yet I still respect and admire Chang-Rae Lee.
Pearl, have you read any Chang-Rae Lee?
Yes, I have. But where would you recommend someone start with Chang-Rae Lee?
Well, I think writers don't like it when you say their first book is their best, but I'm not sure it's his best, but it's my favorite, Chang-Rae Lee's book, Native Speaker, which came out good Lord, I think now in the early 90s, maybe mid 90s. But it's about a young man in New York City, and his family, I believe, runs a bodega. There's a bodega that functions in it. I can't remember exactly if this family or not, but it's a very intense novel about assimilation and other things. And it sort of put him on the map, Native Speaker did. I believe there's a film made of it. I can't entirely remember, but I think that's the place to start.
Pearl, what did you review this week?
I reviewed a book that I also regretted, but for different reasons. I reviewed a book called Gay Bar by Jeremy Atherton Lynn, and I regretted it because I suddenly remembered what it was like to go out, and I was filled with yearning, and it was just a very hard book to read, sitting, on my couch since March. But it's a really interesting, original, different book. It's a memoir and cultural history of queer nightlife, and each chapter describes a bar that was meaningful to the author, and peels back history to sort of look at different bars in that particular city, the history of queer nightlife as a site of resistance. I mean, there are not that many other civil rights movements that began in clubs to begin with, but that's the story of queer liberation to some degree, with places like Patch and Stonewall. It's this beautiful, strobing look at coming of age and going out, why we go out, of how gay bars affirm and challenge your sense of identity, how they are the place of community. What does community mean? Why do they so consistently disappoint? And it was just very, very affectionate. And I think as a memoir, very unusual in the sense that you learn very specific things about this writer, and you don't learn a lot of what you're used to gleaning from a book like this. We don't really understand much about his childhood. We don't really know where he's from. We don't really know what he does for a living. We meet him like we would meet him in a bar. We see other things about him, different sort of aspects. And it's not often that you see innovations in memoir. At least I feel like I don't see people doing something different and recasting some of these aspects. And I was moved and impressed. And yeah, I recommend this one.
But not if you miss nightlife.
Not if you miss nightlife. Oh my God.
All right, I have a question now from a listener. This is from Joe Bigelow, who writes about picking up James Joyce and reading A Portrait of the Artist as a young man and Ulysses. And then he says about the latter, "The book has faced me down in a way, making me want to learn it, read and reread it, study all those confusing lines, and explore the many works it references. So as I bounce between hewing through this jungle of a book and scanning my copious reading list, which is filled with many 21st century titles, a question has surfaced in my mind. How does a reader, especially one with limited time, balance exploring the many and varied books by contemporary authors that flow onto bookstore shelves month after month, and delving into the many indispensable works of the past? How do you choose what you should read?" Over to you guys.
For me, it's like appetite. It's like any other kind of appetite. Sometimes I'm in the mood for something substantial, and sometimes I want to snack. Sometimes I want to try what other people are talking about. There isn't really a plan, but I think underlying the question is the deeper idea of what is our relationship to the books that we feel like we ought to read. And in that way, I think I'm very annoying in this way, because I started out reading as a very ambitious reader when I was small. I was obsessed with the idea of canons and classics. And, we moved a lot growing up. And so every different place I lived had a different set of classics and a different set of books that we were told mattered. And I think I was very interested in looking at those books and trying to figure out the places I was in by looking at what was prescribed and what was heralded. So I think I've always been very attracted to the idea of reading the classics, not just because they're good, but because I think that they are very revealing about what the culture is telling itself and telling people about what matters. And then I think on another level, also equally annoying perhaps, but I have a very sentimental feeling about these books that one ought to read. I think that they are like the Taj Mahal. You have books like the Makioka sisters or Anna Karenina. They're some of the best things we've ever done as a species, So the notion of obligation has always been very complicated to me, because it's always been really, really saturated with a sense of excitement and license. So I think that in my garbled way is my response to this. But in practical terms, I think I do read around a lot. Like, I hadn't read The Magic Mountain and picked it up and read that. And then I wanted to chase that with something like, I think, like a mystery, and then like a book to review. And so it really does, in the everyday sense, you attend to it like any form of appetite and sort of seek a kind of balance, I think.
Can I just interject, Pearl? I love your answer, but I have that same kind of obsession and affection with books that whatever nameless headmistress haunts my brain, like says that I should read. But I have one especially for books that have fallen, like that used to be on that list, but have fallen off for one reason or another. Like I'm sort of obsessed with why, Last of the Mohicans, like once considered something then what ought to read, and now it's not. And then I almost, it makes me want to read those sort of books even more, the ones that for whatever reason were considered the books and then for whatever reasons fell off the list. Like it's like the fallen heroes of the Western canon sort of intrigue me because it then tells you doubly so, like what you were talking about. It gives you insight into the culture that put them there and then also into the culture that then took them off.
I think so. I mean, it's like classics is a symptom of something also, So I think the kinds of conversations, I mean, we touched on this a little bit in our chat about Gatsby on the podcast a few weeks ago, and I remember reading it in school and you'd mentioned that it isn't taught and in the same way necessarily as broadly as it once was. So I think it opens up lots and lots of questions about not even just story, but certain kinds of aesthetics that fall out of fashion, certain kinds of heroes, all of these things, which I think if you care about book chat, if you care about all the conversations that attend a book are very fun to have. But Dwight, I'm curious about you. What's your relationship with reading and obligation and the classics and the canon and all that?
Well, my experience was very different, Paul. I only became a reader, I think, when I really threw away any notion that I should be reading canonical books. I was really tired of the books that I was told that I should read. And when I finally understood that I could read whatever I want is when I really understood what books could mean to me. And I realized that, for example, while young, that Dickens wasn't for me and other writers weren't for me. And I went out and one of my favorite quotes is Randall Jarrell, the poet, said, "Read at whim." And I went out and just started reading. I don't know. I read whether it was Jack Kerouac or rock star biographies or books about sports or the things I was into when I was 11, 12, 13, 14. I mean, I read some good books too, but I also had friends, luckily, who were misfits and outsiders and weirdos who were a little older than me and the kind of kids who were well read and would pass along books to me, and books of poems and books of just strange things. And I realized that if you're going to become a big reader, you've got to just eat what you want to eat in terms of your input, mental input. And if you're lucky, as I think and hope I have been, the things that you want to read and the things you should read become closer together, that pile. You develop a taste, you learn what you like, and your taste grows. But speaking just for right now, I mean, I read out of obligation at times, of course, but I still love to read the things I love to read, which sometimes are just things like cookbooks or a chef's memoir or someone just told me 2 days ago that Rob Lowe's book about Hollywood is like the great Hollywood memoir. And I thought, wow, okay.
No, I've read it, Dwight, and I don't know why I read it, but I have read it and can attest to that. Yeah.
Oh, so it is.
It's on my shelf, actually.
Someone said, I think it was Roy Blunt who said that learning about books at some place like Harvard or Oxford is like learning about the opposite sex at the Mayo Clinic. I mean, and I see that point, and you've got to read what you want to read.
All right, can I just say something about Rob Lowe, since we're on the subject, tangentially? Were either of you at the book review when Rob Lowe came into the office?
Oh, no, thank God.
Oh, yeah. He came into the office and sat down with my predecessor, Sam Tannenhouse, and Sam interviewed him when this memoir that we're talking about came out. And I have to tell you, people at the Times can be pretty blasé. No one was blasé when Rob Lowe came in. It was like a massive crowd, gathered and, was standing outside the glass wall of Sam's office while Rob Lowe was in there. Like, no one was cool.
I wish I'd been there. It's funny. I often ask people, just like a dinner party question, who the person they've ever been around personally who had the most charisma. They just felt like the waves of charisma pouring off these people. And my answer is, I was in the book review. This was pre-podcast days. And the podcast at the book review brings more and more sort of well-known people up into the building. But this was before that, when it was somewhat rare that a major writer would come into the building. And I was sitting at my desk. This was the old Times building on 43rd Street in Manhattan. And I was turned away from the front door, but I just felt a force behind me. And I turned around. It was Cornel West and it was Henry Louis Gates Jr., the two of them. And something about those two men, maybe together, they had a force field that I just felt before I even saw them.
Pearl, whose force field have you felt?
I think I had a similar feeling once, no, I know, I can't even answer this. I can't
You
even
can
answer
say me,
this.
Parl. It's okay. You can admit it.
It's just us.
No, but I feel like I've seen like my only sort of celebrity encounters have been people like absolutely in complete civilian mode, no charisma, nothing, but like very moving to see them in that way too. Like running into Philip Seymour Hoffman, like eating a bagel with a child on him. Like that's where I tend to see my celebrities, like just doing laundry, like not in a exuding that sort of that force field, unfortunately.
Which is why New York is so great.
Which is why New York is so good, yeah. But I think that there's something very telling about this conversation that went from Joyce to Rob Lowe. Actually, celebs, they're just like us. So I don't know what that's.
I wish Philip Seymour Hoffman had written a book. He would have written a great book.
I do too. I mean, why do we think he would have written a great book? Because he's a great actor. Why do we think he would have had a facility with language?
Well, he also ran his own theater company. I think he was a creator. He wasn't just like a vehicle for other people's characters. I felt like he created them. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also that feeling that you have with certain actors that they bring something a little extra to every role.
Oh.
It's like he doesn't need, it doesn't need to be as good as he would make it. Like he knows something else. Like he's bringing his own like little novel that he's creating that we never get to see, except that his performance is always so much richer and more mischievous and wicked than it has to be.
Right. It's like the little flapping of the arms in those small scenes he has in The Big Lebowski. That alone, it's like he didn't need to do that, but he did.
I saw him too, Parl. He was riding his bicycle out on Jane Street in the West Village, right outside of the Corner Bistro, where people used to go for cheeseburgers, myself included. And he was just biking by. There he was. Ah, New York.
We'll see it again one day, perhaps. All right. Parl, Dwight, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.